All right, now continuing on with politics, legal battles over the election results are still playing out in courts across the country. Joe Biden is the projected winner of the race, but President Trump is still refusing to concede. His campaign has filed a number of lawsuits surrounding the vote counting process in some key states. So here to break down some of these cases, our campaign reporters Alex Tin, who is following the races from Arizona and Nevada, and Zach Hudak, who is covering the legal challenges in Pennsylvania. You guys are in, I'm not just saying this to be biased, the two most interesting states, I think. Georgia's pretty interesting too right about now, though. So Alex, we're going to start with you. There is a hearing scheduled in Arizona. The Trump campaign says that Maricopa County incorrectly rejected some votes on Election Day, and they have a long list of witnesses ready to testify. So what is the strategy here? What do we know about these witnesses?
Well, the Trump campaign and the Arizona Republican Party are specifically looking for what they say is a hand count of these so-called overvote ballots. These are ballots that were rejected and ignored by the ballot tabulation machines for having a stray mark, or maybe a voter, bubbled in one too many candidates for their presidential election. But what's important to understand about their strategy is their hand count, they hope, will increase the number of their supporters they say were disenfranchised by these so-called overvotes. But what we're likely going to see at the hearing, and what is likely an uphill argument for the Trump campaign and Arizona Republican Party going into this hearing today, is, take it from Arizona's Attorney General, Republican Mark Brnovich. There are three facts that are making their lives very difficult right about now. Number one, his office and other Republicans in the state have looked into these allegations of so-called overvotes due to, the use of Sharpies at ballot boxes. They say it's little more than a conspiracy theory. It's been debunked. Number two, the total number of votes we're talking about is probably a few hundred votes. Now, keep in mind, Joe Biden's lead above President Trump in Arizona is small, but it's still more than 10,000 votes. A few hundred votes falls far short of that. And number three, Maricopa County, like counties all over Arizona, have conducted random sample hand count audits of their ballots that they've counted. And Maricopa County, like counties all over Arizona, passed with flying colors.
So election officials in Pennsylvania say only 10,000 votes came in after Election Day, but the president's legal team is still challenging these votes in the Supreme Court. Joe Biden is ahead by more than 50,000 votes in the state. So even if all of those votes were thrown out, the Trump team couldn't sway the results. So, Zach, why continue with this lawsuit?
Vlad, it's actually even a little bit more perplexing. Those 10,000 votes are not even included in the totals that we see that have Joe Biden up by more than 50,000 votes. So why are they fighting this lawsuit? Well, first, they didn't know it was only 50,000, or I'm sorry, they didn't know it was only 10,000 votes that would come in within this 3-day extension after Election Day when this lawsuit started, which began with the state Republican Party. The Trump campaign joined it right after Election Day. And really the reason is because even as Joe Biden pulled ahead, there are still several other categories of votes that we don't have all of them tallied. They're provisional ballots, which are paper ballots that you would fill out in person if you had a problem with proper identification, or if, say, you had applied to vote by mail and then simply didn't send in your mail ballot, or you worried it might not get there in time. You would fill one of those out. There were about 100,000 of those. Some of them are still being tallied. And the state until Tuesday was still accepting some overseas military ballots. So there are still ballots coming in. And if anything, you could say the Trump campaign was banking on those other ballots, pulling them close enough to get within recount territory, which is if the total is within a 0.5 percentage point. Right now it's within 0.75 percentage point. But really, at the end of the day, Vlad, elections officials and legal experts seem to think this is more than anything about making noise. It seems almost certain that even if those ballots were thrown out, the results would stay the same. And I just want to point out again, those ballots are not included in the 50,000 vote lead that Biden already has in the state.
Yeah, in fact, Pennsylvania may be the one state where the campaign can chalk up a couple of really minor wins, and one of them has to do with setting aside these ballots that came in after the Election Day. they were put in the mail by Election Day. They just arrived a little bit later. So yeah, they were set aside, and as you point out, they weren't counted, and so they're not even contributing to the final count that we're seeing right now. Another area where they had a tiny win had to do with these observers and how close they could stand. But there's still a case about that, whether or not poll watchers, even though they were given an opportunity to stand a little bit closer, whether or not they were close enough. Can you tell us why they're continuing this fight? What, particularly because now the election's done and over with, what is it that they wanted to see that they couldn't see?
Well, poll watchers have been a major focus of the Trump campaign's legal efforts and Republican legal efforts in Pennsylvania for months leading up to the election. The big issue in October was whether they could be in these satellite elections offices, which were set up for essentially early voting. It was technically mail voting. You would go in, request the mail ballot, and return it all in one stop, but it was essentially early voting. Poll watchers were not allowed in there, the court ruled, and the Trump campaign nonetheless sent them and then sort of made a big thing out of it when they were not allowed in line with what the court had ruled. So poll watchers are something that the Trump campaign has for a while brought up as a potential place where state officials are trying to facilitate fraud. The purpose of them is both campaigns are allowed to have them in there, just watching to make sure nothing nefarious happens. And it is really rare that something nefarious happens in there. And also, Anne-Marie, I would point out, this is in Philadelphia, which they were live streaming their counting. I think they still are live streaming what remains of it the entire time, 24 hours. So you or I could go online and take a look. Their complaint was their poll watchers were being kept 10 feet from counting rather than, as the law says, 6 feet. And the local court initially denied their motion, and then the Commonwealth Court, right down the street from me here in Harrisburg, the Trump campaign appealed to it, and they said, you know what, those poll watchers do need to be closer. And counting briefly halted, and essentially a portable fence was moved 4 feet closer, and then it resumed. And the case we have right now is Philadelphia, their Board of Elections has appealed that decision. And I think what that's really about for them is sort of setting a standard to go forward and have this ruling they can point to when in the future there are disputes like this. They can say, this has already been decided, and if it comes out in their favor, it would be that they acted within their discretion to move the poll watchers back a little bit.
So, Alex, in Nevada, Trump allies and GOP officials have claimed 3,000 people voted illegally because they don't live in the state. Can you please, for our viewers, explain what the issue is here and why some people who don't live in the state are allowed to vote there?
Well, to be clear, it is legal to vote while you're out of the state of Nevada, like in all of the states around this country. That's called absentee voting. But to be fair to the Trump campaign and their Republican allies, as well as their other allies outside the state party, here is their best case argument for what they're pointing out. You know, they've looked at records. For example, one of their allies looked at records of people who moved to Nevada and then moved from Nevada to California right next door, registered to vote in California, and then cast a ballot in Nevada. That's one batch of voters. Another batch of voters that they're questioning are these voters who filed a change of address request with local elections officials. So that means they moved to somewhere outside of Nevada, said, I've changed my address, please forward my mail, but never changed their address with Clark County. That's another batch of voters. The issue with that second batch of voters, and the reason that, you know, the Trump campaign and the Republicans on their best days have been trying to say, look at all these voting irregularities, is because Nevada Secretary of State says, like in many other states around the country, the Postal Service does not forward mail ballots. So when they were mailed a ballot to that address was never forwarded to wherever they're living now, whether it is here or overseas. But again, like in Pennsylvania, like elsewhere in the country, like in Arizona, they've faced legal defeats in Nevada. In fact, the only remaining federal case we've been tracking last faced a legal defeat last week. We haven't seen any new activity in that case this week. So it's unclear, number one, how these voting irregularities, and again, most of them are just irregularities. We have yet to see any example of actual widespread voter fraud, would lead to any change in the results. Unlike Arizona next door, Joe Biden has a much larger lead as a share of the total votes in Nevada. And as Nevada nears certification of those results, it's unclear what path forward remains for state Republicans or the Trump campaign to do little more than, like as Zach said, make noise about their unhappiness with what they claim are voting irregularities in this process. And let me just mention one more thing before I forget. Local officials, state officials, they say, yes, it's true. Voting fraud does occasionally happen. They've investigated that before. A registered Republican in the 2016 election voted twice, once in Nevada, once in Arizona. But the key thing is we know about these instances because elections officials and elections authorities, they investigate these reports, they run these reports down, and those people, probably a handful of them, will be prosecuted and brought to justice. But will it impact the results? Probably not.
Alex Tin, Zach Hudak, thank you both for your reporting. We appreciate it. Nice job.